Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome. This event today is focused on government overreach in the wake of COVID-19. And there's no one better to talk about this particular topic than Mr. Hiram Sasser, Executive General Counsel for the First Liberty Institute. There, he oversees First Liberty's litigation and media efforts. He's had ample experience arguing appellate issues before both the state and federal courts, in addition to the trial level, including the Texas Supreme Court. In addition to his legal duties, he's made numerous media appearances, including on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, and the BBC. Prior to joining First Liberty, Mr. Sasser graduated summa cum laude from Oklahoma City University School of Law, where he received recognition as the outstanding graduate. Mr. Sasser has even had the opportunity to serve as Chief of Staff for the Attorney General of Texas. This is going to work as a discussion, which Mr. Hiram will lead. He will be giving a speech, after which you guys will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. Go ahead and make sure your microphone's muted throughout the discussion, and if you have any questions, send them to me through the chat feature, and I will be happy to go ahead and pose those to Mr. Sasser. And with that, I will let him take it away.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me. It's obviously this has kind of been a pretty busy week. I actually was in San Diego earlier this week, and I'm hitting a plane tonight to go to DC because I'm going to testify in front of Congress tomorrow morning for the very thing that we're sort of talking about, which is on that it's about religious liberty and COVID-19 and the overreach on religious institutions, and also a little bit about the history of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and its help for religious liberty causes. So I'm the sort of, I guess, the defense of the Department of Justice, so to speak, on that in that role. But anyway, I guess I'll get started by kind of make sure that we kind of go over the history of what happened and how it related, especially to religious institutions, and what our strategy was at First Liberty to try to make sure that the Constitution was not completely abandoned. So if you guys go back and you kind of remember, in my household we call it the before times. In the before times, there. You know, we had the 15 days to slow the spread that turned into 30 days, and then around the end of March is when various governors and mayors and then county officials and people you've never even heard of, most people I didn't even never even knew their names, suddenly showed up and were issuing edicts as if it was the law, and like they were Judge Dredd or something like that. They could just execute the law as they saw fit, and so they started issuing these all these regulations and whatever, we were trying to figure out well, if you're going to shut down church services, how long can they do that for? And we sort of came up with an assessment that in a time of concern for a spread of a disease and things like that, the government has the authority and power to temporarily suspend lots of different constitutionally protected activities, including religious institutions meeting in person. And so we actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post early on that outlined that yes, indeed, that it's within the constitutional purview of the various officials on a temporary basis to to disallow constitutionally protected activities such as churches meeting together. And we had that posted in the Washington Post, and and it was what we thought was a good explanation for the next coming couple of weeks or so. But as you all know, it kind of kept going and extending, and the shutdowns got more specific and longer, and to the point where in a town in Mississippi, and in Louisville, Kentucky, they actually, the mayors there banned drive-in church services. So a lot of religious institutions got creative and decided, well, we can't meet in person in the building, we'll do something different. And so they started the drive-in church service, which is that the cars would drive and park in the parking lot 6 feet apart. And a pastor, a religious leader would, do the sermon and everything else, either over using a bullhorn or like a short range radio broadcaster where you would tune in to a radio station, much like you might at a Christmas light display or something like that. If you ever driven through one of those Christmas light displays, and it says turn it to channel such and such, on your radio. And so that was going fine for a lot of communities, but in Louisville, Kentucky, and in Greenville, Mississippi, they decided that the virus could penetrate steel and glass somehow magically, and so they were going to ban drive-in church services. So we ended up suing both of those entities, one in Greenville and one in Louisville, two different cases. In Greenville, the mayor raised the white flag and early on and said, we quit, and stopped the ban, and that was great. In Louisville, Kentucky, the mayor did not do that. They fought to keep the ban in place. And so we ended up getting a temporary restraining order written by Judge Justin Walker, who's now on the DC circuit. And he wrote a great opinion, sort of outlining religious liberty, and that this is a significant overreach. The case that everyone sort of fights and quibbles about is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and in that case, that was not even it's kind of a weird substantive due process case before there was even any kind of what you might call categories of scrutiny. There was no strict scrutiny as such. That language is sort of foreign at that time, and it was about mandatory vaccinations and not about just these complete massive shutdowns. And the shutdowns that we have right now really aren't, for the length of time that they've been in place and the breadth and the depth, have really not been judicially explored in our history. There's been short times when there's been shutdowns. There's been some short cases that have been involved, some limited type things, but nothing that is as comprehensive as what we're experiencing now. We've never gone to a fully centrally planned economic and liberty model before in our nation's history, and that's kind of where we are. But so we got a good victory on drive-in church service, and that's kind of where we felt comfortable. We told them, again, this is still in the middle of April, so we haven't even gone 6 weeks yet, and we kind of put look, this is not scientific. There's no precedent for this, but we kind of decided internally in our office that temporary is somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks long. And then after that, we're going to have some problems constitutionally dealing with, these types of shutdowns. And so around the beginning of May, we decided it was time to file a lawsuit for in-person church services. So we ended up representing a church in Kentucky that was in a county that had very little virus activity. And we sought an injunction, and the Attorney General of Kentucky, Attorney General Cameron, intervened and asked for a part of the relief to get a statewide injunction. And the way we fashioned it was, wasn't just willy-nilly. We fashioned it as we basically crafted what we call, the church's, protocols and guidelines, mirroring some of the CDC guidelines. And so these are all the guidelines we're going to follow, and we want to open church according to those guidelines. And so the order that we got that ended up being a statewide injunction was for 25% capacity, no numerical cap, 6 feet apart, masks encouraged but not mandated, and that was it. and we got a statewide injunction. So things were going pretty well on that front. So we started turning our sights on some other states to go see. And as you know, the makeup of the judiciary in various parts of the country are, it's different. And so you have to have different tactics for different locations. And so we, many of the locations, like the locations in the Fifth Circuit, which would have been a good place to bring a case, in my opinion, they began to lift the restrictions pretty quickly on religious activity. And so there wasn't really any room to bring a case there. But we next turned to what we thought was the toughest nut to crack, which was Illinois. And in Illinois, we were going to do a different tactic. That tactic was what I call the bull rush, which was we basically just signed up a bunch of churches that said we're going to open according to these CDC guidelines. And if you want to come for us. And then that's where we will have our case. There was another organization that was also doing a case in Illinois. And while that case was pending before the Supreme Court, but had not been ruled upon, the Governor Pritzker of Illinois decided to raise the white flag and said, well, we're not going to apply these restrictions to religious institutions. We filed a lawsuit in the state of Washington over in-home Bible study. Things were making a lot of great progress, but then a case out of California made it to the Supreme Court. And I mean, as you guys know, what ended up happening was it was 5-4. The emergency relief to the church was denied. And I think it's significant to think about that. There were 4 justices willing to give emergency relief in California so that they would not have in California a numerical cap of 100 people. Because there are some buildings there that hold 2,000-3,000 people. So, if you can hold, 2,000 people at 25% capacity, that would be 500 people, blowing way past the numerical cap of 100, which is just sort of artificially imposed. I don't know if you saw the LA Rams and the Dallas Cowboys game, but there were more than 100 people in that dome, right? So they can play football there, but they can't have church at the same level. Or recently I was in San Diego. There's more than 100 people taking up every seat on the airplane. And we're all packed in there just fine. And we're all packed in the waiting room just fine. We can all go fly. That's fine. But you can't go to a religious church because, the virus knows if you're traveling on American Airlines or if you're at church. It's sort of like in Texas, right? If you have a plate of food and a beer, the virus cannot get to you. But if for some reason you don't have the plate of food, but you have your beer, then the virus will attack you, which I guess means you're supposed to not complete your plate of food because you need a little bit of food there to ward off the virus. I don't know. It's like a pocket full of posies, during the plague. But nevertheless, so we ended up having a significant problem because Chief Justice Roberts, at least to his credit, wrote something to explain why he was breaking ranks with the traditional conservative bloc and going with the people who were perfectly fine with, sort of centrally planning the shutdown of the church. He wrote something for us so we could know kind of what he was thinking. And basically what he said was that the language, he doesn't cite to it, but mirrors Employment Division versus Smith, which is that unless you have some sort of comparator that's like a church, or at least and we'll talk about what I mean by like in just a second, but like a church or religious institution of some kind, then if you're not allowing those types of things in then there's no religious liberty violation. And unfortunately, that's probably an accurate description of Employment Division versus Smith, but we have to talk about what does the comparator have to look like. One of his things was his little throwaway line was he said something to the effect of that, well, being in church for a long time is different than sort of just passing briefly into various locations, such as a laundromat. So I was like, well, I mean, I don't know how to explain this to Chief Justice Roberts, but like, a laundromat is like where you sit there for like a couple of hours, like doing your homework or reading or something like that, surrounded by a bunch of other people doing the same thing for a couple of hours, and all their stinky clothes and like sharing. I mean, I just assume that he's never used a laundromat, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what his lifestyle has been. I know his wife was like a bartender in Australia or something. So I know she's used a laundromat. Maybe he could have gone home and asked her, how does this work? But anyway, we learned from that case is that Chief Justice Roberts has never been in a laundromat. Then there's another subsequent case that got packaged up by another organization out in Nevada. Great case. Casinos are open, where everybody's gathered together, for long periods of time, gambling, all sitting there gambling and doing something else that's sort of bad for your health too. They're all smoking too. Or, if you've ever been to a Las Vegas casino, I mean, it's, you're gonna have to burn those clothes that you walk in there with, right? And so they're smoking and drinking and whatever and having a good time, and there's lots of people there. But for whatever reason, he didn't think that casinos, he doesn't explain this, but didn't appear to think that casinos were a good comparator to churches either. So I don't know what the comparator is. It's looking for the way you can value. The way I always thought you measured the comparator was you measured will this activity cause the same or similar harm to the religious activity? Not does it kind of look like it, but does it cause the same kind of harm? Because what's the government interest that we're measuring here? Prevention of harm, right? And in this case, it's the spread of disease. Well, disease at church, well, I mean, some people, I guess, think it does, but it doesn't know that, right? And so whether you're all for gambling purposes, or you're all gathered in the building together, these purposes, they should be treated the same because it's the same harm. It's allowing so many people in the same building. That's the issue. And if the issue is spacing, well, you solve that easily with a rule, a narrowly tailored rule that says must maintain X amount of space or must use a mask or whatever. But for whatever reason, and that, of course, there's 4 justices that dissent. They have some really great writings. I commend those to you to read. Nice advocacy pieces on why religious liberty deserves, and so what does that leave us with? Well, what it left us with is that religious institutions are sort of beholden to wherever they happen to be located in this country. And so if you're in Texas, you can do whatever you want. You practically cannot meet. If you're in Washington, D.C., not only could you not meet indoors in Washington, D.C. at all, you cannot meet outdoors. You cannot meet beyond a certain amount of people. And outdoors, you also have to be masked away you are from any particular person, unless you're engaged in one of the coronavirus repelling activities, such as jogging or something like that, because the virus can't catch you. Although there is no particular mile or mile pace, it's not. I would have thought that you don't have to wear a mask if you run faster than a 9-minute mile. That maybe that would even make a little bit more sense, right? Because I assume it's the jogging exception is because of speed, right? You can outrun the virus, and so I don't know what that speed is, because you have people who can walk pretty fast, and I'm being mostly facetious here, but I mean, that's how sort of farcical some of this nonsense is. And again, I'm not opposed to rules about, to prevent the spread of the virus and that sort of thing. I sort of think that the private marketplace typically takes care of that. In other words, if you put out guidance and scare the living daylights out of everybody, like everyone's scared now, and people should be scared or not, but say if you guidance, you'll scare everybody, and everybody will then begin to make individualized decisions about how to properly take care of themselves. And and maybe the outcome wouldn't be a whole lot different, but it wouldn't be because the government made you do it. It'd be because people were sort of doing it appropriately. There's no constitutional violation to the crowd giving you dirty looks. I mean, that's that's up to you. But anyway, so what we did last night, this is great. You guys are getting sort of the early breaking news. It's in the Washington Post, but last night we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., so that they can meet outdoors without a numerical cap, but with and masks outdoors too. Because we're okay with masks, we're okay with spacing. We just want to be able to all meet together and meet outdoors. I don't know if you've seen the news, but there's been some other meetings that have been taking place outdoors. Some other gatherings. We take no issue with those gatherings. We just want to be able to have our gatherings for a religious purpose. And so for the first time, we're in any of these COVID restrictions, we're able to bring a content discrimination claim, a speech claim, which is you allow the gathering for one type of content, but you're not allowing a gathering for another type of content. Those are typically kind of difficult to prove, but when the mayor has gone on the record and said that we prefer this message over that message, and we're going to allow this but not allow that, and that's not the same thing, they shouldn't be treated the same, and lots of other quotes that are sort of highlighted in our complaint that typically, you just never would find in a case. I mean, we just sort of have a treasure trove of those quotes. And so that case has just been filed, was filed last night. We're asking for a temporary restraining order. And so you will find out what's going to happen. Meanwhile, obviously, there's a significant change going on at the Supreme Court, which means that there's a possibility. I mean, you don't know. You never know, A, are they going to confirm somebody? And B, will they confirm somebody who agrees with with Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Alito? But if that happens and whoever is there agrees with those four, then Roberts is out of luck, and his laundromat rule goes by the wayside, and some different rules can begin to take shape for religious liberty. I'll just sort of wrap it up with this, and we'll open up with questions. Is that on Good Friday, when we filed that TRO asking for temporary restraining order for Easter Sunday, it was at the we didn't know anything. I was hunkered down, and I told you I'll let that speak for itself about what I on the fear meter is. I was very nervous for a lot of different reasons, and I think most people were. That was the very first order that enjoined any kind of COVID restriction at all, and so I think there's something there for Judge Walker. There's a certain amount of courage because you walk on the ledge, not knowing. It ended up being received well. It's drive-in church service. I mean, the worked out well, but there still was kind of a great unknown. But the reason I point that out is that religious liberty was the banner that sort of led the charge on attacking some of these orders and their constitutional overreach. I think there's a reason why religious liberty is the first one mentioned in the Bill of Rights. I think it's there because it's a foundational right, and it's difficult for a totalitarian to exist when the people believe in something greater than themselves, and that's why it's typically the first freedom that is restricted by a new totalitarian regime, and they don't want competing allegiances. And I just found it interesting that it was the one sort of leading the charge to free us from some of the government overreach. And so hopefully, again, on this next phase of litigation, religious liberty will be the one that kind of gives us a little bit of a breakout from just some of the what I would call the ridiculous side of the other restrictions. But anyway, I'll end here, and I see Aaron. Aaron, I saw you wave your beer. Cracking me up there in the airport. That's fantastic. All right, well, I'll open it up now for questions, and I don't know how we're going to moderate that, but however we do that, happy to answer questions.
I'll jump in and give one a try. Is my microphone coming in clear enough and not overwhelming with ambient noise? Great. So for those of us on that part of the spectrum that maybe think the masks are overkill, myself included, at what point do we have kind of a freedom to, engage in a sort of civil disobedience? Obviously, this is not something so profound as to require a moral response, but, at what point do we just say this is a dumb law and I don't want to follow it?
Well, look, I'll answer it this way. Let's say we went back in time to March 15th and there was an announcement that we're going to carry on with life as normal, but we're just going to mandate that everybody wear a mask. I think we all would have just worn a mask. I don't think anybody would have had a problem with it. If that's the plan, masks are the plan, masks work, I think that would have been, I don't think there would have been anybody resisting. I think the reason why some people are resistant to the masks now is because they just see it as a continuation of government overreach. I view masks as, the uniform of the day. I was in the Army, and so I guess personally for me, the mask thing it doesn't hit me personally as hard. I have to think it through philosophically because I see it as like, this restaurant requires a coat and tie, so I wear a coat and tie, or this place requires a mask or whatever. And so I just sort of see it that way. But the real issue is it typically on any assertion of any constitutional right, the burden of proof is on the government. And the issue that there are with a number of these sort of COVID restrictions are that no one has really shown up and been made to prove it up at the courthouse. Most judges have been overly deferential to the government, and so no one's ever had to prove it up. With competing experts and that sort of thing. I'm not suggesting that that's a good idea to have that case. I'm not looking for that type of case, but I'm pointing out that at some point we'll have to get to the point where the government has to prove the effectiveness of the things that they're trying to impose. And the sooner we get to that, the better off we'll be. Who knows? Maybe they prove it up that, requiring masks is fine. I will say this on a humorous level. 5 years from now, I plan on wearing a mask wherever I go. And like doing the invasion of the body snatchers scream, "Oh!" to anyone who's not wearing a mask, and just see what the reactions are. Just like 5, maybe 10 years from now, just bust that out and see what happens. Anyway.
Good question, Aaron. So you mentioned that you had a case involving in-home Bible studies out of Wisconsin. So how can you walk us through how that went? Did it require an actual suit? Were you able to send a letter and have the city stand down? How exactly did that work? Because it seems a little bit extreme to ban the in-home gathering.
Yeah, actually, that was, if I said Wisconsin, I apologize. It was the state of Washington, and we sued the governor there. What ended up happening is, in the middle of us seeking the TRO, the governor's office basically raised the white flag and said that they're not going to oppose, and that their rule does not ban, an in-home Bible study under a certain number that we were asking for. Then, we had some discussions with them about moving that number up. They were somewhat resistant. I said, well, that's okay. We'll kind of get to the bottom of that in our deposition with the when we deposed the governor. And then what ended up happening was basically we got comfortable, and I won't get into the discussions, but we got comfortable that they would never enforce it against a home Bible study. We dropped the suit, and they never enforced it against any home Bible study. We'll just sort of leave it at that.
So I actually am from Washington. I'm in Washington right now, and I'm a Christian. So on behalf of all of us, thank you, because I've actually hosted Bible studies at my house since COVID. So thanks.
Well, you're very welcome. I've got another case brewing out of Washington. Coach Kennedy, the coach that prayed on the 50-yard line, and the one that the justices at the Supreme Court, when we sought Supreme Court review, sent back and said, well, we're not going to grant review now, but this raises interesting issues such as whether or not Employment Division versus Smith should be overturned. It's like, wow, So that case is going back up to the Ninth Circuit. We've lost at every stage on that case, but yet it's still going on since 2015, and maybe we'll make it to the Supreme Court, and we'll even have a better Supreme Court, so we'll see.
I have a question for you. I'm in California a lot, and as you know, here, Newsom has just absolutely banned us from having church. And even when he put out his rules, I mean, families had to sit 6 feet apart, your kids couldn't go to class, and and then he did that for a short time, and now it got banned again. But when they start doing all these BLM rallies and then allowing them to do it, I think a lot of churches just said, forget this, because we have quite a few churches that are holding services anyways at this point. Are there any suits going on right now here to help so that churches can actually start meeting again normally?
Yeah, there's a lawsuit going on right now. There's another organization that's handling that with John MacArthur's church. And it's not going that well for the church. But I think what you're going to find, Sherry, is that this case out of DC, I think, is packaged properly so that we can go get a win, and a significant win. And I think, the problem is that you have to win things to make a difference. You got to go win your stuff, and you got to package it properly. And, there's some good cases that are out there that are fighting what I call the righteous cause, which is they're just trying to do the right thing and they're fighting. And you got to have those cases. But then every now and then you got to package up a case. It's sort of what I call the golden arrow that's going to, hit correctly. And I think that this one in DC has got all the markings of something that could break it open for not just DC, but all across the country.
Can the state go after the individual people that are going to services? Because for the churches that are saying, forget it, come to service, because there's quite a few here now that are saying, forget it, we're having service.
After the individual people, I guess theoretically, but they never have, and I doubt that they would.
Gotcha.
That would really that would raise some interesting arguments that they probably don't want to deal with.
I don't know. This is California. Everything is
Well, you know, they got to be able to see you before they can arrest you, and you know, I think you got a pretty good smoke screen going on over there.
I mean, we have to pay for our grocery bags, for crying out loud. Everything is not normal.
No, I know. I was just there, and
Yeah.
Texas is a little better.
Yeah,
a little bit better. Thank you.
I'm going off the question that
I'm a native
Sherry,
Illinoisan, and so
go ahead, Aaron. You can go ahead.
no, yours is a follow-up. Take your priority.
Oh, yeah, mine was following up off of Sherry's question. You guys were talking about whether or not you think the government will go after the individuals, and you said probably not. Have any governments gone after churches, or do you know how they would do that, and maybe what the response to that would be? Because I know that would probably create a lot of conflict.
Yeah, well, they have. I mean, there's been some fining going on, and we currently represent a church in California that we haven't made decisions about what to do, but they're currently being fined $500 every Sunday, and I think they've, I mean, that's kind of what's going on. And if that's the fine every Sunday, and you just pay you $500, then I mean, it's you have to have different solutions for different jurisdictions, and California is just a real tough place to do a case. Whereas, and DC's tough too, but it just has that feel that we could get it up to the Supreme Court a little faster, and I think maybe get us a national ruling that could help. In the jurisdictions where it's the toughest, and so that's the so the upcoming makeup of the Supreme Court, that could have an immediate impact. The election can impact these things too. So I mean, it's California is tough, but it's going to take us winning in other places and building up a momentum. I view this almost the same as like sort of the World War II strategy against Japan, which is you notice we didn't load up the troop ships and just go invade the homeland, right? I mean, we island hop. We hit island after island, slowly working our way towards the main islands. And so I think that's the strategy here, which is we're going to have to island hop a little bit and slowly make our way towards places like California that are more heavily entrenched.
I'll shift it to another question. What are some other areas that these kinds of, whether it's mass, whether it's gathering, what are some other areas that this is going to reach into? Obviously, we've talked a little about religion. I'm thinking about the Illinois law that says if you have a face covering, then you can't conceal carry a weapon. What are some other areas that these kinds of things are going to touch on that either we've seen or we can perhaps expect to see?
Well, the CDC just put out some guidelines on all the various regulations that they recommend for Halloween. And so, the problem is that everybody wants to be able to say we're doing something. No one wants to be accused of not doing. We must do something. You got to do something. And so, what ends up happening is guidance gets put out that then governors and mayors and county officials fashion into rules. And then they enforce them. And of course, there's a never-ending cycle. Let me just give you an example, really, how this plays out. Let's take a school district deciding whether or not to open schools. How this plays out is this. All right, superintendent and school board, they're not medical experts. They don't know. What do? They go and they consult the CDC guidance, right? And so let's say the CDC guidance says, yeah, you can open schools, but the kids need to be spaced in a certain way. You need to do it in a certain way or whatever. And let's say they say, okay, that's what we'll do. So they sort of float out that they're going to open schools, right? Well, what happens? The local television station calls them up and says, we heard you're opening. How can you possibly do this safely? Superintendent, what's your plan? And the superintendent panics. He doesn't want to look like he's, he or she are going to kill kids or teachers or whatever. And so they're like panicking. And so then what they do is they slap on extra stuff, extra theater or hygiene theater, or whatever you want to call it, to try to look like they're being even more careful than the CDC guidance, which is, we'll start virtually for 3 weeks and then, we'll enter or whatever. I call that the punt. Or they'll say, we'll limit the classrooms to only 6, people per classroom or whatever, and kids will only go to school every other day. These are all things that are not in the CDC guidance, okay? But they'll add those things because of the pressure, because the media will pound anybody who does something different than go in a hole and hide. And so if your plan is different than go in a hole and hide, then you're going to have the media, running sensational stories. And it's just going to be a matter of what's the government officials' toleration for that kind of resistance. And so if you translate that and you kind of see that out, it's almost like there's a competition for who can come up with the most Byzantine rules, right? And so, everyone wants to be known as the most careful leader. And so they'll say, you're allowing in that county 75% restaurant capacity. Well, we're only going to allow 50% restaurant capacity. Where's the study that says what the difference is on that? And have they really read it? Was it really a scientific basis that was based on? It's most likely that was just based upon a competition to be the most careful in that particular media market. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be regulations or guidance or whatever. I mean, there's obviously different studies and different, opinions on that. But, I will cede the territory that there should be some sort of guidance or regulations and that sort of thing. But what they look like are often driven by media concerns rather than, sort of careful scientific study. Even, and how do you know that? You know it when they deviate from the CDC guidelines and they add belts and suspenders to the CDC guidelines. That's when it's the competition for the most careful. And then sometimes the CDC gets carried away. Like, they had that proposed regulation that never, or guidance that never got passed, which was banning choirs. And it was like, President Trump said, why are we getting overly prescriptive about this? This is crazy. Maybe they might be able to figure out how to do what they need to do if you just give them some distance suggestions. So anyway, it's I think what bothers most Americans is it doesn't look, they're told it's in the name of science, but it doesn't look very scientific. Even though at the baseline, somewhere buried down there are scientific studies that do support some of these guidance and regulations. And it's hard for people to pick out what's grandstanding versus what's based on science when everything is being declared as based on science. So I think that's what's difficult for people to accept. Our point on our issues is not to get involved in the epidemiology of it all. We don't take any issue with any health officials or what conclusions they make. All our cases have been about is treat like activities or activities that would have the same kind of health impact, just treat them the same.
I just, are you at all concerned that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Are you concerned that the ability to shut down religious services in the first place is kind of a slippery slope? Because now, because there wasn't really any evidentiary standard that anyone ever met or presented to the public in any capacity, like there's no ongoing standard to meet. And so really it just, I read somewhere that like 10% of the CDC employees wanted to declare racism as a national emergency. And so are you concerned that like, because religious services were able to be shut down in the first place, that it could be kind of a slippery slope, I guess?
Well, I was not concerned about that in March or April. You know, it all seemed very reasonable at that time. You know, I think we need to have a developed body of law on what the appropriate standards are. And we need to be able to have those standards essentially litigated in both courthouse and in public space. But most importantly, more important than all of that, is that we need a return back to the Republican form of government that Article 4 of the United States Constitution promises us. And unfortunately, that's not a justiciable issue. I hate that when they give you when the Constitution says you shall have, you know, and then like the courts later say, well, that's not justiciable. It's like, okay, well, you know, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to get our Republican form of government back? Because the last time we had to get our Republican form of government back, like we created a mess. It was called the American Revolution. I mean, do we really? We don't have to do that. Like, can't we do this civilized this time? But the legislatures have to take back their power. See, there's a big difference between a governor issuing just some random edict and a legislature issuing the rules and regulations. Because see, with the legislature does it, you and I get to go down there and debate it. We get to advocate for our people. We get to lobby our people. They all have to get together and they have to cut deals. They have to compromise. Everybody's interests are properly represented. You have medical professionals testifying. You have industry professionals, and it's all done out in the open, and everyone can go attend and watch, and the media covers it. And so you have all the what I call the institutions of freedom, all working together or against each other, but in a way that's transparent. And then we have whatever gets spit out, even if we don't like it. I don't like everything about it. I had a say. I had some way of influencing my government, because why? It was a Republican form of government. We don't have that. We don't even have that in Texas. We have essentially a king who is issuing edicts, and we have no legislature. And so I think most people understood that emergency powers would be something like this. Hey, for the next 30 days, I got to put something in place because this is a new thing and we don't know what to do. And if we need something more than that, I might extend it another 30 days. But the only reason I'm extending it another 30 days is to then I'm also simultaneously saying, and we're calling a special session. We're going to have the legislators, even if they only can convene via Zoom. All right, we'll figure all that out. But they need to come together, and they need to make the policy decision. Where's the governors that would stand up and say, I don't have that power? And that's what's the scariest thing. But it's the thing that our founding fathers predicted. They said it doesn't matter. There are no angels. If you give someone absolute power, they will use it absolutely. There is no one that is going to just voluntarily go, I'm going to place restrictions on myself. That's why structural restraints are important. That's why the structure of the Constitution is important. And we have completely abandoned our structure. And the people that are supposed to be, manning the stations are the legislators, and they're not doing their job. We have the executive versus the judiciary, and the judiciary said, hey, we're going to let the executive do whatever they want. But we haven't heard from the first branch of government, the Article 1 branch. Now, I'm using that by analogy because it hasn't been the federal government that's been issuing national mandates. They've been issuing guidance, but they haven't been issuing national mandates. They don't have general police power. The states have the general police power, and it's been these governors that have been issuing these mandates. And the legislatures need to wrestle back their control instead of leaving it in the hands of governors. We were not meant to be a central planning, authoritarian government system. And it's scary that the media seems to feed into that narrative like that. That's a good thing. I would have thought the media would have resisted that. But we got to get back to the legislature. The legislators will fix this problem because they're more accountable to the people than a king is.
Wonderful. We have one question from the chat, and that is, what do we do with arbitrary restrictions that on their face are applied to all institutions, not just churches, but they do infringe unduly on religious liberty? For example, a UK-style restriction that limits all private gatherings to 10 people. Where does the line fall in the context of religious freedom? What do we do about that?
Well, the answer to that is that under Employment Division versus Smith, that would not be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause. But it would be a violation of most state religious freedom restoration acts. And if the federal government did something like that on a national basis, it would be a violation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or it could be a violation. I don't want to say it would be a violation. It could be. And at the very least, you would have to do the analysis under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is that you would have to figure out, does the government have a compelling governmental interest? And I think we would just cede that point. Yes, you do. You have a compelling interest to prevent, the spread of a deadly disease. Okay. And then the next question is your restriction narrowly tailored to achieve that governmental interest, and or the least restrictive means to achieve that governmental interest? And there is where we start pulling out the measuring stick and try to figure out, is that really true? What is your, and the burden would be on the government, what is your evidence that a gathering of 15 leads to a greater, spread of the disease? What's your evidence of that? You have to show up and prove it. You can't just say it, you're going to have to prove it, and you're going to have to show us all the studies that demonstrate that. Or 12 or 15 or 20 or whatever. Because the question under strict scrutiny is not really what's the government's generalized interest in general. It's why, the real question is, why won't the government give a specific exemption to this particular person engaged in this particular activity? And so it gets evaluated on one-off bases. And the government has a hard time proving it on each one, right? And think about it. Think about how that case would go, right? You would say, well, I want to have 15 people meet, all wearing masks, all 6 feet apart. What do they have to say, essentially? They're going to have to say that masks aren't good enough. 6 feet apart is not good enough. It's the number that counts. Well, that's going to undermine their policies in other locations. And so you get to put them in a box. Well, no one's been able to put them in a box yet because we haven't been able to get to that level of scrutiny yet. I think I got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I apologize. I got to go get to the airport.
Absolutely. We have one more question. Now, you mentioned Employment Division versus Smith a few times, and I've heard other commentators talk about how Justice Scalia, whether he meant to or not, set religious liberty back a ways in that particular decision. Do you think there's a clear strategy or path forward to undo the effects of Employment Division versus Smith? You mentioned that the Coach Kennedy case might be a way to do that.
Yeah, the Coach Kennedy case is not, it's a case that doesn't really involve what I would call the most difficult areas of the culture war, so to speak. He's just wanting to pray silently alone at the 50-yard line, and the only issue is people can see him, and the school district thinks that that's a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so it's not as hot button of an issue. I mean, it's an issue that when you poll it, it polls like 80-20, and so there's not a lot of issues that you could bring on the employment division to go into employment division versus Smith that polled that well. And I shouldn't have to say that. I mean, like, it shouldn't matter, but I mean, it's judges are people, the justices are human beings. And if you want to undo employment division versus Smith, my opinion is that doing it with what I would call a hot button cultural war issue would be it makes it more difficult to get them to do it. So I think employment division versus Smith, at least 4 justices thought it meant something. We're going to have a 5th justice we haven't heard from, I assume. Let's assume someone gets confirmed. So there's going to be a 9th justice that we haven't heard from, but a potential 5th vote to join those 4. And that doesn't mean that Roberts wasn't with them. It would have been awkward for Roberts to have joined a statement that accompanies the denial of cert when cert was denied. Because then, because that's 5 justices. It almost would be like an opinion, And so I actually think that's why Roberts did not join. I think Roberts in there somewhere is an appetite for overturning employment division versus Smith. At least we're hopeful for that. But even if he doesn't, if the next Supreme Court justice does, then those are your 5 votes, and we can finally undo that damage that was done in 1990 and sort of what I call restore the balance a little bit. And it's not it doesn't mean that religion's always going to win. It just means that the government's going to have to show up with a real good case as to why they're not granting a religious exemption in that circumstance. And I think being the first freedom mentioned in the Bill of Rights, like, it deserves like its day in court where the government has to actually like demonstrate some really good reasons why it's engaged in a restriction that has a negative impact on religious liberty. So, I mean, with that, I'm going to make sure I've got my testimony here somewhere here that I got to give, and so if you get bored, I don't know if it's or if you're not in class or if you just want to goof off in class, I don't know. There's I don't know if it's going to be on TV on C-SPAN. I doubt it. It's not that. It's not that big of a deal. But maybe on their website or something like that, you might be able to see this discussion, part 2 of this discussion, and hopefully I'll get some hostile questions. Otherwise, it gets real boring. If you want to see a highlight of a hostile question that I received back in February, I think it's on the First Liberty YouTube page. You can see the debate that I had with Representative Christian Murthy about pronouns, and that's always fun, and I enjoyed that very much. So hopefully we'll have some more fireworks like that, and it won't be boring. But anyway, thank you guys so much. Appreciate you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Hiram had to leave he'll be testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he was asked very last minute, so he had to make sure we could cut this short at 5. But thank you so much for everybody who was able to attend. If you're interested in joining the Federalist Society at Baylor Law, I just dropped our email in the chat, baylor.federalistsociety@gmail.com. And we look forward to having you. We have a series of events planned for the coming year, in addition to some maybe like networking opportunities and socials. So thank you, everybody. And with that, I'll dismiss. You guys have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Lexi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.